1 hour after winning a $300 million lottery, I suffered a sudden stroke. Waking up in a hospital bed, half of my body was completely paralyzed. My son and his wife leaned close to my ear and whispered, "Don't fight it, Dad. You've lived long enough. Everything will be ours." Then they walked away, thinking I was finished. What they didn't know, the moment that door clicked shut, I had already begun. 3 weeks later, they returned begging on their knees. "I'm so thankful for your support on Dad's Revenge Stories." Which city or country are you watching this from? Let me know in the comments. Please note, this story contains fictionalized details created for educational purposes. Any resemblance to specific individuals or places is coincidental, but the message conveyed is deeply insightful. The soup had gone cold again. I noticed it the same way I noticed most things these days, slowly, without much surprise. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a paperback novel I hadn't actually read in 40 minutes, and the bowl of chicken noodle in front of me had gone from steaming to room temperature, while I sat there thinking about the electric bill. My name is Arthur Mills. I am 72 years old. I live alone in a 2-bedroom house on Garfield Avenue in Fresno, California. And I have been living alone for 11 years now, ever since my wife Dorothy passed from pancreatic cancer on a Tuesday morning in October. The house still smells like her sometimes, lavender and cedar. I've never been able to explain it, and I've stopped trying. I worked for 38 years as a watchmaker. Not the glamorous kind you see in magazine advertisements, surrounded by Swiss timepieces and mahogany display cases. I was the practical kind, the man people came to when the watch their grandfather left them stopped keeping time. I had a small shop on Blackstone Avenue. Nothing fancy, just a glass counter and good lighting and the kind of patience the job required. I retired at 65 when my eyes started to argue with the fine work. I sold the shop to a young man named Davis, who I hope is still treating those old movements with the respect they deserve. My pension came to $1,140 a month. After utilities, groceries, and the property taxes I paid quarterly, I had somewhere between $200 and $300 left over. It wasn't much, but it was mine. And I had learned a long time ago that money you earn honestly feels different in your hands than money you didn't. The $400 I sent to my son Brandon every month came out of that remainder. Brandon was 38 years old and lived 40 minutes away in a 2-story rental in Clovis with his wife, Victoria. He had tried 3 different businesses in the past 6 years. A food truck that lasted 8 months, an e-commerce store that sold, as far as I could tell, nothing, and most recently, a landscaping company that bled money for 14 months before he shut it down and blamed the economy, the weather the city permits, and 2 former employees in that order. I never said anything about the businesses. A father doesn't do that. What I did was answer the phone. That particular Tuesday evening, the phone rang at 6:17. I knew it was Brandon before I looked at the screen. He had a pattern he called when something had gone wrong, and he needed to talk to someone who wouldn't hang up. "Dad." He said not hello, just Dad, like the word itself was a complaint. "Hey, son." I pushed the cold soup to one side. "How are you doing?" "Not great, honestly." He exhaled hard into the phone. "Victoria's car needs new brake pads and rotors. The mechanic said $1,200. Can you believe that, $1,200? These people see you coming and they just..." He made a sound of disgust. "Anyway, we're a little short this month." I looked out the kitchen window at the oak tree in the backyard Dorothy had planted the year we moved in. It was dropping leaves in the early October dark. "How short?" I asked. I mean, if you could do the 400 early this month, that would really help. Like now, instead of the 15th. "I can do that," I said. "I'll transfer it tonight." "Thanks, Dad." He said it the way people say thanks when they've already moved on in their heads to the next thing. "Hey, I gotta run, Victoria's calling me. Talk soon." The line went quiet. I set the phone face down on the table and sat there listening to the refrigerator hum. I wasn't angry. I want to be clear about that. I was something quieter than angry, something that takes longer to name. I was tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. I got up, poured the cold soup down the sink, and rinsed the bowl. On the top shelf above the stove, between a box of Earl Grey tea bags and a canister of oatmeal, sat an old tin cookie box. The lid had a faded painting of a winter village on it: red barns, snow-covered pines, a frozen pond. Dorothy had bought it at a Christmas market 30 years ago and used it to store shortbread cookies she made every December. After she passed, I kept it on the shelf. Inside now was nothing but a few old batteries, a spare key, and a folded grocery list in her handwriting that I couldn't bring myself to throw away. I looked at that box the same way I looked at it every evening. Then I opened my laptop, transferred $400 to Brandon's account, and went to bed. I told myself it was love. Looking back now, I'm not entirely sure what it was, but I kept sending the money anyway. I sat in the kitchen for a few minutes. Then I put on my heaviest coat over my 2 sweaters, found my car keys on the hook by the door, and drove myself to the Walgreens on Shaw Avenue. The roads were quiet. My hands weren't steady on the wheel, but I made it there, and I made it back, and I took 2 Dayquil capsules at the kitchen table with a glass of water that tasted like nothing. I found out later, weeks later, from a passing comment Brandon made on the phone that it hadn't been a company Christmas party at all. He and Victoria had been at dinner with friends. Just dinner. Nothing that couldn't have been interrupted for 20 minutes. I didn't bring it up. A father doesn't do that either. What I did was start paying closer attention. 2 months before the afternoon that changed everything, I was sitting in my armchair after breakfast when my phone buzzed with a text message from my bank. It was a notification I hadn't seen before, an alert informing me that a request had been submitted to add an authorized user to my primary savings account. I hadn't submitted any such request. I called the bank immediately. The customer service representative, a young woman who was patient and thorough, told me that someone had submitted a signed authorization form by fax 2 days prior. The signature, she said, matched the one on file. I knew my own signature. I had been signing my name to things for 72 years. I told her to reject the request and freeze any further changes to the account. Then I drove to the branch on Herndon Avenue, closed that account entirely, and opened a new one that afternoon. Different account number, different branch. And this time I did not write the information down anywhere in the house. On the drive home, I stopped at a red light and sat there thinking about who had access to my personal documents. The answer came quickly, and without much effort. Brandon and Victoria had stayed at my house for a long weekend, back in the spring, supposedly, to help me sort through some of Dorothy's things in the garage. I had left them alone in the house more than once. I thought about calling Edward Calloway that evening. Edward was my oldest friend. We'd met on a job site in 1974 when we were both young men with bad backs and strong opinions, and we'd been close ever since. He was the kind of man who listened more than he talked, which in my experience is rarer than people think. I almost called him. Instead, I sat in the driveway for 10 minutes, then went inside and made dinner. I wasn't ready to say it out loud yet, but something had shifted inside me, quietly. The way a watch shifts when a gear slips, you don't always hear it, but the time starts running wrong, and eventually you have to open it up and look at what's really going on inside. I told myself I was being careful. I told myself it was just a precaution. What I didn't tell myself not yet was that I was preparing for something I couldn't name and didn't want to imagine, but something I could feel coming the way you feel weather before it arrives. low pressure in the chest, a stillness in the air that means hold on. Something told me I needed to be ready. Every Friday morning for the past 20 years, I bought a lottery ticket. Not because I believed I would win. I want to make that clear. I am a watchmaker by trade, and watchmakers understand probability better than most people. We spend our lives working with mechanisms that have exactly one correct way to function and 1,000 ways to fail. I knew what the odds were. I had always known. But Dorothy started the habit back in the 90s, picking the same 6 numbers every week, her birthday, mine, and the year we got married, and after she passed, I kept doing it. It felt like something small I could still share with her. $1, 1 ticket, same numbers every time. The Friday everything changed. Started like every other Friday. I woke at 6:15, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with the newspaper for 40 minutes, the way I had done for most of my adult life. The Fresno Bee. I still paid for the print edition. Old habit. The crossword was harder than usual that morning, and I got stuck on 14 across a 7-letter word for persistence for longer than I care to admit. At 8:30, I put on my jacket and walked the 3 blocks to Miller's Corner store on Belmont Avenue. Old Mr. Miller had owned that store for 19 years. He was a precise man who kept his shelves immaculately organized and always had the coffee fresh by 7. He knew my order without asking: medium dark roast, no sugar, and he knew I came in every Friday for my regular lotto numbers. "Morning, Mr. Mills," he said, already tapping the lottery terminal before I'd even made it to the counter. "Just the regular numbers today, Miller." I slid $2 across the counter, 1 for the ticket, 1 for the coffee. "How's your granddaughter doing? She's still at Fresno State?" His face opened up the way it always did when someone asked about his kids. "Junior year now. Pre-med. She's killing me with the tuition, but what do you do?" He laughed and handed me the ticket and the cup. "You look tired, Mr. Mills." "I'm always tired," I said. "That's what 72 looks like." He laughed again, and I took my coffee and my ticket and walked home. I didn't check the numbers until after lunch. That was another habit I never checked in the morning. Dorothy used to say checking too early in the day left you disappointed before you'd even had a chance to enjoy it. So I folded the ticket and put it in my shirt pocket and ate a ham sandwich at the kitchen table. And then I turned on the television at 1 o'clock and found the lottery channel the way I always did. The numbers came up one at a time. The first one matched. I leaned forward in my chair the way you do when you're trying to see something better, even though it won't help. The second matched. The third. The fourth. My heart was doing something unusual by this point. Not painful, just different. A kind of rushing I hadn't felt in years. The fifth number matched. I stood up from the chair without deciding to. I was just suddenly standing. The sixth number appeared on the screen. It matched. I stood in my living room, holding a ham sandwich I had completely forgotten about, and stared at the television for what I believe was a very long time. The announcer was saying something about the jackpot amount. $300 million. The words made no sense to me for at least 30 seconds. They were just sounds like hearing a language I had studied, but never actually spoken. $300 million. I set the sandwich on the arm of the chair. I picked up my phone. I started to dial Edward's number. I don't know why Edward first. Only that he was the person I called when something happened that I didn't know how to process alone. The phone rang twice, then the pain arrived. It started at the back of my skull, a pressure so sudden and complete that I actually looked up at the ceiling as if something had fallen on me. Then the left side of my body went wrong all at once. My arm, my leg, the left corner of my mouth. Like someone had reached inside me and switched off half the lights. I went down, I didn't fall dramatically. I want to be accurate about this. I didn't crash into a table or knock things over. I simply sat down on the floor very suddenly in the space between the armchair and the coffee table, and my body declined to get back up. The phone had landed a few feet away. Edward's name was still on the screen, the call unanswered. I looked at the ceiling and focused on breathing. The ticket was still in my shirt pocket, right against my chest, somewhere between the floor and the darkness that was starting to pull at the edges of my vision. I thought one clear thought. I need to hide this. Somewhere they'll never look. Then I heard Mrs. Margaret Holloway from next door. She had apparently heard the thump through the shared wall and was already on her phone calling 911, her voice sharp, with the particular alarm of a woman who has lived alone long enough to know what certain silences mean. I had never been more grateful for a nosy neighbor in my life. The first thing I was aware of was the ceiling. White acoustic tile, the kind with tiny holes punched through it in a uniform grid. A fluorescent light panel humming at a frequency just low enough that you wouldn't notice it unless everything else was very quiet. It was very quiet. The second thing I became aware of was that my left arm was not responding to instructions. I tried to lift it. Nothing happened. I tried again, concentrating hard, the way you focus on a stripped screw, careful, deliberate, no excess force. Still nothing. The arm lay at my side like something that belonged to another person. My left leg was the same. The left corner of my mouth felt thick and distant like a piece of fruit that had been in the refrigerator too long. The right side of me was fine. My right hand could move. My right foot could press against the mattress. My eyes worked. My mind, and this was the thing I kept checking, kept returning to like a man patting his pockets for his wallet. My mind was completely clear. I was at Fresno General. I knew that from the ceiling tiles, from the smell of the place, from the particular quality of silence that exists only in hospitals at odd hours. A monitor beside me tracked my heart in small green peaks. An IV line ran into my right arm. My shirt and jacket had been removed. I was in a hospital gown, and somewhere in a plastic bag on the shelf near the window, I knew were my personal belongings, including the shirt I had been wearing, including the pocket of that shirt. I could not speak. When I tried to form words, what came out was a shapeless sound that frightened me more than I wanted to admit. I stopped trying after the second attempt and focused instead on breathing steadily and taking stock of what I had. I had my right hand. I had my eyes. I had every thought I'd ever had intact and accounted for running as cleanly as a movement I'd serviced myself. That was enough. That would have to be enough. The door opened at, I looked at the wall clock, 2:14 in the afternoon. A nurse came in and checked the monitor without looking at me directly, the way busy people sometimes don't realize they're doing. She was young, perhaps mid-30s, with dark hair pulled back, and the kind of composed, unhurried manner that I had learned to associate with people who were genuinely good at their jobs, rather than merely performing the appearance of it. She glanced down and found me looking at her. She stopped. "Mr. Mills?" Her voice was calm, but her eyes sharpened with attention. "You're awake. Can you hear me?" I blinked once, deliberately. Something shifted in her expression, not surprise exactly, more like recognition. She stepped closer. "Blink once for yes, twice for no. Can you understand what I'm saying?" I blinked once. "Good." She reached for my right hand and pressed it lightly. "My name is Clara. I'm your nurse on this shift. You're at Fresno General. You came in this morning after a neurological event, what we call a TIA, a transient ischemic attack. Do you know what that means?" I blinked twice. "It's sometimes called a mini-stroke," she said, and her voice was matter-of-fact in the way that good medical people learn to be direct without being cold. It caused temporary weakness on your left side and affected your speech. The good news is that TIAs often resolve without permanent damage. Dr. Reed will be in to explain everything more fully, but I want you to know you are stable. You are safe. I blinked once. She smiled briefly. Then she made a note on her tablet and told me she would be back in 20 minutes to check on me. She was gone for 11. Brandon and Victoria arrived while she was out. I heard them before I saw them, Brandon's voice in the hallway talking to someone at the nurse's station asking which room. Then the door opened, and they came in together. Brandon was wearing a jacket I hadn't seen before, dark green, the kind that costs more than it looks like it should. Victoria had her hair done. Not the casual style she wore around the house, the done kind, the kind that takes time and intention. They had come straight from somewhere, I realized. Or they had taken time to prepare before coming. Brandon stood at the foot of the bed and looked at me the way people look at cars that have been in accidents, assessing damage, calculating cost. "Dad," he said. His voice had the right shape of concern. "We came as fast as we could." Victoria stood slightly behind him, her eyes moving around the room, the monitor, the IV line, the shelf near the window with the plastic bag of my belongings. She looked at that bag for 2 full seconds longer than she looked at me. Brandon moved to the side of the bed. He leaned down, and for one moment I thought he was going to do what a son does, take his father's hand, press his forehead against the old man's knuckles, say something that was actually true. Instead, he turned his face toward my ear, and he whispered, "Don't fight it, Dad." His voice was barely a breath. "You've lived long enough. Everything will be mine." He straightened up. Victoria gave a small nod, the kind of nod that confirms an agreement between two people that was made before they walked into the room. Brandon patted my right hand once, a single pat like punctuation, and said at normal volume for anyone who might be listening through the door, "We're here for you, Dad. You just rest, okay? We're going to take care of everything." Then they left. I lay in the silence they left behind and stared at the ceiling tiles and breathed. 47 years of raising that boy. 47 years of lunchboxes and Little League and college applications and bailing out business after business. 47 years of love, imperfect, stubborn, persistent love, and what it had produced was those 11 words whispered into my ear while I lay unable to move or speak. The grief of it was enormous. I won't pretend otherwise. But underneath the grief, something else was happening. Something quiet and deliberate was organizing itself in the back of my mind, the way gears align before a watch begins to run. The door opened again. Clara stepped back in clipboard in hand and looked at me with the alert, careful expression of someone who has learned to read faces. I looked at her, and I blinked. Twice slowly and with everything I had. Clara did not react the way most people would have. She didn't gasp. She didn't call for another nurse or reach for my chart or do any of the things that would have made noise and drawn attention. She simply stood very still for a moment, looking at me with the particular focus of someone recalibrating what they thought they knew about a situation. Then she stepped to the door, looked both ways down the hallway, and pulled it almost all the way closed. She came back to the bedside and pulled the visitor's chair close. Not the way visitors sit, angled away from the bed for their own comfort, but turned squarely toward me, close enough that she could keep her voice barely above a breath. "Those two people," she said. "The man and the woman who were just here." I blinked once. Their family once. "Is everything okay with them?" Twice. Slow and deliberate. She absorbed that without visible reaction, which told me something important about her that she had seen enough in her years of nursing, to know that hospital rooms sometimes contain more than illness. She leaned slightly forward. Mr. Mills, I want to help you, but I need to understand what you need. Can you try to show me? I moved my right hand. Slowly, with the concentration of a man threading a needle in poor light, I raised 2 fingers and pointed toward the window shelf. The plastic bag. My belongings. Clara looked at the bag, then back at me. You need something from your bag once. She got up, brought the bag to the bedside, and opened it carefully. My wallet, my house keys, my reading glasses in their case, and the shirt I had been wearing folded by whoever had undressed me, the front pocket facing up. I pointed at the shirt pocket, and the lottery ticket still folded in quarters the way I always carried it, the paper slightly worn at the creases from 20 years of the same fold. She unfolded it. Her eyes moved to the numbers. Then, and I watched this happen, her expression went very quiet and very careful, in the way that people's faces go when they suddenly understand that they are holding something that weighs more than it looks. She refolded it without a word and held it in her closed hand. Then she reached back into the bag and found my phone, a small, older model I'd had for 4 years, nothing fancy. She unlocked it using the 4-digit code I indicated by tapping her fingers in sequence on the back of her hand. It took us 3 attempts and longer than I would have liked, but we got there. She opened the messages, found Edward Calloway at the top of the recent contacts. I had been trying to call him when I went down. She held the phone where I could see it and began typing, reading each word aloud as she went, watching my eyes for confirmation. Yes. Kitchen shelf. Yes. Old tin cookie box? Yes, yes. Take it now. Yes. Tell no one. Yes. She looked at me one more time before hitting send, a look that asked without any words at all, "Are you certain?" I held her gaze and blinked once as steadily as I had ever done anything in my life. She sent it. The little whoosh sound the phone makes was the smallest noise I had ever heard and the most significant. Clara slipped the phone back into the bag and returned it to the shelf, arranging everything exactly as it had been. Then she came back to the bedside, straightened my blanket with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done it 10,000 times, and leaned down close. I don't know exactly what's happening, she said, her voice so low I could feel it more than hear it. But I've been a nurse for 9 years, and I know the difference between a family that comes to the hospital for the patient and a family that comes for other reasons. She paused. I'm going to make sure you're okay, whatever that takes. She straightened up, made a note on her tablet, routine, clinical nothing that would raise questions, and moved toward the door. Then she stopped with her hand on the frame and turned back. There was something in her face that wasn't quite professional anymore, something younger and more honest. My grandmother came to this country with $40 and the clothes on her back, she said quietly. She worked her whole life, built something from nothing, and her kids. She stopped, pressed her lips together. You remind me of her, Mr. Mills. That's all. She walked out. I lay in the white quiet of the room and stared at the ceiling, and felt for the first time since I had gone down on that living room floor that I was not entirely alone. The ticket was safe. Edward would get the message. And somewhere in the back of my mind, in the precise and patient place where I had spent 4 decades solving problems that other people had given up on, the gears were beginning to turn. Edward Calloway told me later that he had been asleep for exactly 1 hour when his phone went off. He was 74 years old and slept lightly the way old men do when the body starts treating rest as something to be rationed rather than enjoyed. He reached for the phone on the nightstand, saw my name, and was sitting upright, before he had finished reading the message. He told me he read it 4 times, not because it was unclear, because he was making absolutely certain he understood what I was asking and why I was asking it by text instead of by voice, and what that meant. Edward had known me for 50 years. He understood the difference between a message I sent and a message I needed someone else to send for me. He was dressed and out the door in 6 minutes. My house on Garfield Avenue was dark when he pulled up. He had a spare key on his keychain. I had given it to him 8 years ago, after I locked myself out during a January cold snap, and neither of us had ever mentioned returning it because neither of us needed to. He let himself in through the front door, found the light switch by memory, and stood in my kitchen for a moment, just breathing. He told me later that the kitchen felt wrong without me in it. Too still, like a clock that has stopped. He looked at the shelf above the stove. Earl Grey tea bags, oatmeal canister. And there between them, exactly where I had told him, the old tin cookie box with the faded Winter Village on the lid. He took it down carefully, the way you handle something that belongs to someone else. He set it on the kitchen table and opened the lid. Inside, a few old batteries, a spare key, a folded grocery list in handwriting he recognized as Dorothy's, and at the very bottom, beneath everything else, the lottery ticket, sealed in a small plastic sleeve I had put together from a report cover and a piece of tape. The kind of careful, improvised preservation that was entirely consistent, he told me, with everything he knew about how I thought. He held it up to the kitchen light and read the numbers. Then he sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where I had eaten cold soup, and transferred $400 to my son's account for more months than I wanted to count, and he put his face in his hands. He was not a man who cried easily. He told me he didn't cry then either. He just sat there for a few minutes with his face in his hands, and when he lifted his head, his eyes were dry, but something in them had changed. He put the ticket in the inside pocket of his jacket, turned off the kitchen light, and locked the door behind him. He came to the hospital the following evening during Clara's night shift. She had left his name at the nurse's station, with instructions that he was to be brought directly to my room, regardless of visiting hours, a small procedural flexibility that she executed with the confidence of someone who knew exactly which rules existed, for good reasons, and which ones didn't. Edward walked in and looked at me in the bed and said, "Well, you look terrible." I blinked twice, which made him laugh, a short, genuine sound that was the best thing I had heard since I woke up in that room. Clara closed the door and stood with her back to it. "There are a few things you both need to know," she said. She reached into her scrubs pocket and removed a small device, a hearing aid, matte gray, the kind with Bluetooth connectivity that I had purchased 6 months ago from an audiologist on Herndon Avenue. I had worn it every day since. Mr. Mills was wearing this when he was admitted. It's a Phonak audio model. It has a feature most people don't use, automatic ambient recording that syncs to a paired smartphone. She looked at Edward. "Everything said in this room while Mr. Mills was conscious has been saved as an audio file." Edward looked at the hearing aid, then at me. "Everything," Clara nodded. "I've already backed it up to a USB drive. It's in a safe place." Edward was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at me with an expression I had seen on his face exactly twice before in 50 years, once when his son was born, and once when his wife was diagnosed with something that turned out to be nothing. An expression of complete unguarded feeling that he allowed himself only when there was no point pretending otherwise. "You always were the most prepared man I ever knew," he said. Clara produced the paperwork. Next, she had done her research during her break, pulling up the California Lottery's requirements for third-party prize claims. A notarized power of attorney signed by the ticket holder naming a designated representative. The hospital had a notary public on staff, a quiet woman named Mrs. Decker, who came to the room at 11:15, verified my identity from the hospital records. watched me sign my name in careful right-handed letters that looked nothing like my usual signature, but were witnessed and dated and perfectly legal. Edward took the documents and the ticket and stood at the door before he left. He looked at me through the narrow window in the door for a long moment. He didn't wave. He didn't say anything. He just gave me one slow nod, the kind that means I've got this, and I won't let you down, and I know what this cost you to ask. That was enough. That has always been enough with Edward. I closed my eyes after he left and lay in the dark room and thought about 50 years of friendship, borrowed tools, and long phone calls, and the particular comfort of someone who has known you long enough that you don't have to explain the important things, only the details. Whatever happened next, the ticket was safe. The recording was safe. And for the first time since Brandon had whispered those 11 words into my ear, I felt something shift inside my chest. Not hope exactly. Something more durable than hope. Certainty. Dr. Thomas Reed was not the kind of man who made small talk. He came in on the morning of my second day at Fresno General at 7:50, while the breakfast cart was still making its rounds down the hall, and the light through the window was the pale, uncertain kind that belongs to early November mornings. He was 50 years old, broad-shouldered, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead that he never seemed to actually use for reading. He had the unhurried manner of someone who had learned, probably through difficult experience, that rushing through a conversation in a hospital room almost always cost more time than it saved. He pulled the chair close to the bed, sat down, and looked at me directly. "Good morning, Mr. Mills. I'm Dr. Reed. I've reviewed your scans and your blood work from yesterday." He paused, giving me space to process. "What you experienced was a transient ischemic attack, a TIA. The imaging shows no permanent damage to the brain tissue. The weakness on your left side and the speech difficulty are both consistent with temporary disruption of blood flow. And in the majority of cases like yours, patients recover full or near full function within days to weeks." He folded his hands on his knee. "I want to be straightforward with you. You were lucky. Not everyone is." I blinked once, slowly. He nodded. "Clara briefed me this morning. She told me you've established a communication system." He glanced at the door closed, as Clara always left it now when she was not in the room. "She also told me some other things, about the visitors you had yesterday." I held his gaze. "I'm not going to pretend I didn't hear what she said," Dr. Reed told me, and his voice was level and careful, the voice of a man who chose his words with the same deliberateness I once used, choosing the right tool for a delicate movement. "I'm also not going to tell you what to do. You're my patient. My job is to keep you safe and give you accurate information. What you do with your situation is your business." He paused. "But I want to ask you something directly, and I need an honest answer." I blinked once. "Go ahead. Are you in danger from the people who visited you yesterday?" I thought about that for a moment. Not danger the way he meant it. Not physical, not immediate. A different kind of danger. The kind that wears a jacket that costs more than it should, and pats your hand once and says, "We're here for you," in a voice meant for the hallway. I blinked twice. Not exactly. He accepted that. "Is there something you need from me?" I raised my right hand and pointed at the chart clipped to the foot of the bed. Dr. Reed looked at it, then back at me. Understanding moved across his face slowly, like light crossing a room as the sun shifts. "You want me to not update your chart?" he said. "You want your recovery to remain undocumented?" I blinked once. He was quiet for what felt like a long time. I watched him working through it, the professional obligations, the patient rights, the particular ethical territory he was being asked to walk into. He was not a man who would do something careless. That was exactly why I was asking him. Under HIPAA, he said, finally thinking aloud, a patient has the right to restrict access to their medical information. You've already updated your healthcare proxy form to designate Edward Calloway as your sole authorized contact for medical decisions and information. He looked at me. Which means your son has no legal right to your records or your prognosis unless you authorize it. I blinked once. And you haven't authorized it. Once. He took his glasses off his forehead, looked at them, put them back. I can document your condition accurately while restricting external access to that documentation. That is within your rights as a patient and within my obligations as your physician. He met my eyes. What I cannot do is falsify records. What I can do is be thorough, precise, and very quiet about what those records say. I blinked once, and I meant it with everything I had. He stood up. Clara tells me you're already showing voluntary movement in your left hand this morning. He said it neutrally, factually, the way he might note a change in barometric pressure. I'll check again tomorrow. Officially. He moved towards the door. Then he stopped, and without turning around, he said something I had not expected. My father worked the same job for 41 years. Retired with a handshake and a gift card to a steakhouse. A pause. When he got sick, my brother flew in from Denver and spent 3 days going through the filing cabinet while my father was still in the bed down the hall. Another pause. I've seen this before, Mr. Mills. More times than I'd like. He opened the door and walked out. Clara came in 20 minutes later, carrying a cup of ice chips and the particular expression of someone who has been waiting to tell you something. I need to tell you about yesterday morning, she said, sitting down. When you first came in. She set the cup on the table. The surgical team needed consent to perform a procedure in the first hour. Standard protocol, they needed a family member or designated proxy to sign off. Her jaw tightened. We called your son's number 11 times over 6 hours. I stared at her. He didn't answer until 2 in the afternoon. She looked at her hands. When we finally reached him, the procedure window had already passed. We'd stabilized you another way, so it worked out. She looked back up. He was at the Gold Rush Casino in Clovis. Someone in his contact list told us when we called looking for him. Her voice stayed even, but her hands were pressed flat on her knees, the way hands press flat when the person attached to them is working hard to remain professional. Edward Calloway was here by 8:30 in the morning. He signed what needed to be signed. He stayed until noon. I looked at the ceiling. 6 hours. His father on an operating table and my son was at a casino pulling a lever and hoping the universe would hand him something he hadn't earned. Some things, when you finally see them clearly, don't make you angry. They just make you very, very tired. And then underneath the tired, something harder and quieter takes shape. From that moment on, every time Brandon and Victoria walked into my room, I closed my eyes, steadied my breathing, and became the helpless old man they needed me to be. Edward left for Sacramento before sunrise. He told me later that he stopped at a gas station on the outskirts of Fresno for coffee and a breakfast sandwich. He didn't finish, and that he spent most of the 2-hour drive north on Highway 99 in complete silence. No radio, no podcasts, nothing. Just the dark valley opening up ahead of him in the headlights and the quiet weight of what he was carrying in the inside pocket of his jacket. The California Lottery headquarters sits on North 10th Street in Sacramento, a building that looks considerably less dramatic than you might expect for a place where life-changing sums of money change hands on a regular basis. Edward arrived 40 minutes before the doors opened and sat in his car in the parking lot, watching the sky go from black to gray to the particular pale blue of a November morning in the Central Valley. At 9 o'clock, he went inside. He told me the woman at the prize claims desk was named Patricia, middle-aged, efficient, the kind of person who has processed enough winning tickets that the numbers no longer produce any visible reaction. She reviewed the ticket, first running it through the verification scanner twice. Then she reviewed the notarized power of attorney, checking the document number, the notary seal, the date, and my signature against the identification records on file. She looked up at Edward over her reading glasses. "You understand," she said, "that the named ticket holder, Arthur Mills, is designating you as his authorized representative for the purpose of this claim only. The funds will be dispersed according to the instructions provided in the accompanying trust documentation." "I understand," Edward said. "And Mr. Mills is aware that the lump sum election, after federal and state tax withholding, will result in a net disbursement of approximately $191 million. Edward told me his voice stayed even when he answered. "He's aware." Patricia nodded, made several notations, and began the processing paperwork. It took 4 hours. There were forms Edward had not anticipated: additional identification verification, a secondary review by the claims supervisor, a brief interview conducted by a lottery security officer whose job Edward understood was to ensure the claim was not the result of fraud or coercion. Edward answered every question directly and without elaboration, which was, I had always thought, exactly the right way to answer questions you have nothing to hide about. The funds, Patricia explained, would not transfer instantaneously. The California Lottery disbursed large prizes in certified bank transfers that typically cleared within 3 to 5 business days. The trust account Edward had established, a revocable living trust, with specific distribution instructions that a Fresno attorney had helped him prepare in the 48 hours between my message and this moment, would receive the full amount upon clearance. 85% designated for 2 purposes: a protected educational and care trust for my grandson Sam, locked until his 25th birthday, and a charitable fund directed to 3 organizations in Fresno that Dorothy had volunteered with for most of her adult life. 15% retained for my personal use. Not a dollar of it in Brandon's name. Not a dollar of it in Victoria's. Edward called Clara's cell phone from the parking lot at 1:17 in the afternoon. Clara was on her lunch break, sitting in the small staff room on the 2nd floor with a sandwich she also didn't finish. She came to my room immediately after, closed the door, and sat in the chair beside my bed. She leaned forward and spoke quietly. Edward called. "It's done, Arthur. Everything went through." She paused. "He said to tell you it's all done." I looked at the ceiling for a moment. $1. Every Friday. Dorothy's numbers, her birthday, mine, the year we got married. 20 years of $1 tickets tucked into a shirt pocket and checked after lunch, and almost never thought about again. I had never once actually believed it would happen. Clara watched my face. "Are you okay?" I turned my head toward her and blinked once, slowly. She reached out and covered my right hand with both of hers for a moment. Not the professional contact of a nurse checking a pulse, but the human contact of one person steadying another. Then she straightened up, smoothed her scrubs, and became a nurse again. "Brandon called the front desk this morning," she said, and her voice shifted into the careful neutral she used when delivering information she did not enjoy delivering. "He asked about your prognosis. The charge nurse told him your condition remained stable, but that recovery timelines varied for patients your age." She met my eyes. "He didn't ask to speak with Dr. Reed. He didn't ask to come in." A pause. "He asked if there was any paperwork he should be aware of regarding your estate." I held her gaze and felt something in my chest that was not quite anger and not quite sorrow, but lived in the neighborhood of both. "I told the charge nurse you had requested no information be shared with outside callers. Clara said. She noted it in your file. I blinked once. Outside on the other side of the city, my son was somewhere in a house I had helped pay for, looking through drawers he had already looked through, turning over objects he had already turned over, searching for a piece of paper that was at that moment $191 million away from his reach. I thought about Dorothy. I thought about the way she used to pick those lottery numbers slowly, carefully, like she was choosing something that mattered. I thought about the tin box with the faded Winter Village on the lid. I thought about 38 years of servicing watches that other people had given up on. Some mechanisms I had learned look broken when they are only waiting. I closed my eyes and let the November light through the hospital window fall across my face. Somewhere down the hall, the breakfast cart was making its rounds again. Life continued in its ordinary way. And underneath it, quietly, everything had already changed. Clara had a younger brother who worked as a loan officer at a credit union on Blackstone Avenue, and she had grown up listening to him talk about the particular kind of person who borrows money they cannot afford to repay. She recognized the type. She told me the way doctors recognize symptoms not from a single sign, but from a pattern of them arriving together. She recognized it immediately in my son. She told me what she had pieced together over the following days, from what she heard at the nurse's station, from what Brandon let slip during his brief visits, from what Victoria said loudly on her phone in the hospital parking lot below my window on a Tuesday afternoon, when she apparently forgot that hospital rooms have windows. I listened to all of it from my bed, eyes closed, breathing steady the way I had been practicing since the morning Dr. Reed and I reached our agreement. On the 7th day after my admission, Brandon met with a man named Gary Holt. Gary Holt was 45 years old and ran what he described on the business card he carried in a silver case as a private financial consulting firm. What he actually ran, Clara's brother would have recognized in under 60 seconds, was a high-interest personal lending operation that occupied the gray area between aggressive capitalism and something considerably less polite. He worked out of a leased office on Shields Avenue, drove a black Ford F-250 that was always freshly washed, and had the kind of patient, pleasant manner that people who loan money at 22% monthly interest tend to cultivate carefully. Brandon borrowed $15,000. He signed a contract that Clara's brother had, he read, it would have described using words I will not repeat here. The relevant terms were these: the principal plus interest was due in full within 21 days, the loan was secured against personal property, and failure to repay triggered Gary Holt's right to collect that property by whatever means the contract specified. Brandon signed it without reading past the first page. He told Victoria about the loan over dinner at a steakhouse on Shaw Avenue that same evening, the kind of place where the menus have no prices on the woman's copy, a tradition that had always struck me as more insulting than romantic. Victoria ordered the ribeye. Brandon ordered the same. They split a bottle of wine that cost more than my weekly grocery budget and talked about which neighborhood they wanted to live in once they moved into their new house. Their new house, the one they had not yet purchased, with money they did not yet have. The next morning, Brandon put $8,000 of the loan money toward a down payment on a vehicle, a 3-year-old Chevrolet Tahoe black with leather seats and a sunroof, and a payment plan that assumed an income Brandon did not have. He drove it off the lot and called Victoria immediately. "Come outside," he said. "I'm out front." Victoria came out of their rental and stood on the sidewalk and looked at the Tahoe with an expression that Clara described secondhand from a neighbor who happened to be walking past as the expression of a woman who has just received confirmation of something she already believed about herself. "We deserve this," Victoria said. Then she went back inside and opened her laptop. Over the next 4 days, according to the shipping notifications that began arriving at their rental address, Victoria ordered 2 handbags, a pair of boots, 3 dresses, a set of luggage, and something described on the receipt which Brandon later mentioned to a nurse while filling out an insurance form, apparently without registering who he was talking to, as a luxury skincare package that cost $940. She photographed the handbags when they arrived and posted the pictures to her Facebook account with a caption that said simply, "New chapter." The comments filled up with congratulations from people who did not know what they were congratulating. On the 10th day, Brandon came to visit me. He stood at the foot of my bed in the dark green jacket and looked at me with an expression that I had learned over the previous week and a half to read very accurately. It was the expression of a man running a calculation, measuring remaining time against remaining patience. He reached out and pressed my foot through the blanket, not the way you touch a person, but the way you test something to see if it responds. "Dad," he said, "we really need to find that ticket." I kept my eyes closed and my breathing even. "I know you can hear me," he said quieter. "The docs say you might understand more than you let on. So I'm just going to say it." He leaned on the bed rail. "We've made some commitments, financial commitments, based on what's coming. And we're going to need to move pretty quickly once you're able to tell us where it is." The monitor beside me tracked my pulse in small green peaks. He waited 30 seconds. Then he straightened up, adjusted his jacket, and walked out without saying goodbye. Clara came in 4 minutes after he left and found me with my eyes open, staring at the ceiling with the particular expression she had learned to read as accurately as I had learned to read Brandon's. "He's in over his head, isn't he?" she said. I blinked once. "How far over?" I raised my right hand and held my thumb and forefinger very far apart. Clara looked at the space between my fingers and pressed her lips together. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay." Neither of them had once asked Dr. Reed how I was actually doing. They didn't need to. In their minds, the ending had already been written, the furniture already chosen, the address already decided. All that remained from where they were standing was the minor administrative detail of a dying old man telling them where he had hidden a piece of paper. They had no idea the piece of paper was already gone. Clara came in on the morning of the 9th day with a cup of ice chips. She sat on the table without looking at me, which was how I had learned to tell when she had something difficult to say. She sat down. She straightened her badge. She looked at the window for a moment. Then she looked at me. "Mr. Mills," she said, "I need to tell you something, and I want you to know that I debated whether to tell you at all. But I decided you had the right to know." She folded her hands in her lap. "Your daughter-in-law was at your house yesterday." I kept my face still. "She brought 2 men with her. Your neighbor, Mrs. Holloway, the one who called 911 the day you came in. She watched from her porch and called Edward afterward." Clara paused. "They loaded your television, your refrigerator, your kitchen table, and several boxes of personal items into a pickup truck. Mrs. Holloway said it took about 2 hours." I looked at the ceiling. 41 years I had lived in that house. Dorothy and I had bought the kitchen table at an estate sale in Clovis the summer after we got married. A solid oak piece with a drawer on each side that still stuck in humid weather the same way it had stuck the day we brought it home. The refrigerator had been a 20th anniversary gift to ourselves. The year business at the shop was good enough that we bought something, just because we wanted it rather than because the old one had broken. The television was just a television. But the table. "There's more," Clara said. I looked back at her. "The watches." 2 words. She said them quietly and waited. "I had begun collecting pocket watches when I was 26 years old. Not valuable ones at first flea market finds estate sale lots, the kind of pieces that other people passed over because they were tarnished or stopped or missing a crystal. I learned to see past what was broken to what was underneath. Over 38 years of running the shop, the collection had grown to 47 pieces. Some of them I had restored myself. Some of them I had purchased already running from estates whose owners' families had no idea what they had. A few of them were genuinely rare: an 1889 Waltham in a gold-filled case, a Hamilton 992B railroad grade that kept time within 4 seconds a week, a small Elgin that had belonged, according to the documentation I had paid extra to acquire, to a man who died at the Somme. I kept them in a mahogany case on the bookshelf in the second bedroom. Dorothy used to dust the case every Saturday morning without being asked. Clara said Mrs. Holloway told Edward they took the case, the whole thing. She said they put it in the back of the truck like it was furniture. The monitor beside me registered something, a small acceleration in the green peaks, the only outward sign of what was happening inside my chest. I had never once mentioned those watches to Brandon. Not their age, not their condition, not what some of them might be worth to the right buyer, which was more than Brandon would have guessed, and less than they were worth to me. To me, they were 47 small engines that I had brought back from silence. 47 things I had made work again when someone else had decided they were done. Victoria had sold them to a second-hand shop on Blackstone Avenue for $800. Edward found out from Mrs. Holloway 40 minutes after the truck left. He called 3 second-hand shops before he found the right one. He drove there, walked in, and told the man behind the counter that he wanted to buy back the watch collection that had been brought in that morning. The man said they hadn't finished pricing everything yet. Edward said he would take it, as is unpriced, the whole case, whatever they wanted for it. They settled on $3,200. Edward brought the case to the hospital that evening during Clara's shift. He carried it in with both hands and set it on the table beside my bed without a word, the way you set down something that belongs to someone else and that you are relieved to be returning. I looked at the case. I looked at Edward. He pulled the chair close and sat down heavily, the way a man sits when his body is reminding him that he is 74 years old and has been driving back and forth across Fresno for 9 days on someone else's crisis. "She sold Dorothy's grocery list too," he said. "Mrs. Holloway found it on the sidewalk, blew out of one of the boxes." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a folded piece of paper, slightly damp at one corner from the November air. "She held onto it for you." He set it on top of the watch case. Dorothy's handwriting. "Milk bread, the good coffee, not the cheap kind. Call the plumber about the kitchen sink, don't forget. Arthur has a dentist appointment Thursday." I had not cried since the morning I went down on the living room floor. I had made a decision in the hours after Brandon whispered those words into my ear that I would not spend what strength I had on grief. There was too much else to do with it. But I looked at that grocery list for a long time. Edward sat with me and did not say anything, which was exactly right and exactly what I would have expected from him. After a while, Clara came back to check the monitor. She looked at the grocery list. She looked at me. She reached out and adjusted my blanket with the careful efficiency she always used, and then she left the room again, quietly. Outside the window, Fresno went about its evening. Headlights on the street below. The smell of someone's dinner drifting up from somewhere. A dog barking 2 blocks away and then stopping. Victoria had sold 40 years of my life for $800 and driven away without looking back. But the watches were here. Dorothy's list was here. And I was still here. That would have to be enough for tonight. On the 10th day, the door opened at 2 in the afternoon, and my grandson walked in alone. Sam was 12 years old, and built the way I had been built at his age, thin through the shoulders, long in the legs, with the slightly unfinished look of a boy whose body had not yet decided what it was going to be. He was wearing a gray hoodie with his middle school's name across the chest and carrying a backpack that he dropped by the door with the particular carelessness of someone who has never had to think about what things cost. He looked at me in the bed, and his face did something that Brandon's face had never done in any of his visits. It crumpled. Not dramatically, he was 12 and trying hard to be composed the way boys that age try to be composed when they are frightened and have decided that showing it would be the wrong thing to do. His chin tightened. His jaw worked. He crossed the room and pulled the visitor's chair very close to the bed and sat down in it and took my right hand in both of his. His hands were cold from outside. They warmed up fast. "Hi, Grandpa," he said. His voice was careful in the way voices get when the person using them is not entirely sure they will hold together. I looked at him. I blinked once, slowly. "I know you can't talk right now," he said. "That's okay. You don't have to." He looked down at my hand and then back up. "Mom dropped me off. She's in the car. She said she'd come up in a few minutes, but..." He glanced at the door. "She's been on the phone since we left the house." He was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, a maintenance crew was doing something on the roof of the adjacent building, the sound of equipment carrying faintly through the glass. Sam watched my face the way children watch the faces of people they love, when those people are sick with the complete unguarded attention that adults lose somewhere along the way and almost never recover. "Are you scared?" he asked. I considered the question seriously, the way it deserved to be considered. Then I blinked twice. Something shifted in his expression. Not relief exactly, more like the particular reassurance of hearing an honest answer from someone you trust. He squeezed my hand once and let out a breath. "Good," he said. "Because I looked it up. What you had. The TIA thing. I looked it up on my phone and it said most people recover pretty well if they get help fast." He paused. "Mrs. Holloway got you help fast." I blinked once. "I'm going to send her a thank you card," he said seriously. "I already wrote it. I just need a stamp." That nearly broke me open. 12 years old, and he had written a thank you card to the neighbor who called 911. I had taught him that not directly, not in so many words, but the way you teach children things without knowing you are teaching them through repetition and example over years and years of small, ordinary moments. He had been paying attention. Sam looked around the room, at the watch case on the table that Edward had brought. His face brightened slightly. "You have your watches here." I blinked once. "Good." He nodded, satisfied, as if this confirmed something important. Then he was quiet again for a moment, turning my hand over slowly in his, the way he used to turn over interesting rocks when he was small. "Grandpa," he said. His voice shifted into a register that was slightly different from the one he'd been using, younger somehow, and less careful. The register of someone saying something without fully understanding the weight of what they are saying. "Are we going to get a new house soon?" I kept my face perfectly still. "Mom said when..." He stopped, started again. "Mom said that after things get settled, we're going to move somewhere with a pool." He looked up at me with the open, uncomplicated expression of a boy who has not yet learned to recognize the difference between information and evidence. "She said I could have my own bathroom and a bigger room for my stuff." A small pause. "Dad already put a deposit down somewhere." Mom seemed really excited. I looked at the ceiling. I breathed in. I breathed out. The monitor beside me held steady. I had become over 10 days reasonably good at managing what my body broadcast when my mind needed to stay private. But underneath the steadiness, something enormous was moving. Not anger. Something older and heavier than anger. The specific grief of a parent who has raised a child and watched that child become someone who would tell his own son that the house they were planning to take was coming at the cost of his grandfather's life. Sam was still looking at me. His expression was beginning to shift, something uncertain moving into it as he registered in the wordless way children register things that he had said something that changed the air in the room. "Is that okay?" he asked quietly. I looked back at him. I managed something that I hoped resembled a smile or at least the suggestion of one. He seemed to decide that was good enough. He tightened his grip on my hand and leaned back in the chair and started telling me about a science project he was working on, something involving volcanoes and baking soda. And I lay there listening to his voice fill the room with the particular bright, ordinary noise of a 12-year-old explaining something he found genuinely interesting. I listened to every word. Clara caught up with me later that evening after Sam and Victoria had gone. She had seen Brandon at the elevator on his way down from the floor, jaw-tight, phone pressed hard to his ear. She had overheard enough to understand that the meeting at the bank had not gone the way he planned. She sat down and told me what she'd pieced together. Brandon had carried the property documents for my house on Garfield Avenue to a branch of Bank of America on Blackstone that afternoon, intending to use the property as collateral against an emergency loan large enough to cover what he owed Gary Holt, and buy himself additional time. The loan officer had reviewed the documents and pulled the title records. The property, she had explained to him in the careful, neutral language that bank employees use when they are delivering information a customer will not want to receive, was held in trust for a minor beneficiary named Samuel Arthur Mills. The trust had been established 18 months prior and was irrevocable until the beneficiary's 25th birthday. The current resident, Arthur Mills, retained lifetime right of occupancy. No party other than the named trustee had legal authority to encumber, transfer, or collateralize the property in any form. Brandon had asked to speak with a manager. The manager had told him the same thing. He had walked out of that bank with nothing in his hands, and a debt that was not getting smaller, and a clock that was not stopping. Clara watched my face as she finished. 20 minutes later, she said, he and Victoria were both on their way up here. I blinked once. I already knew what they would look like when they walked in. I already knew how to look when they did. I closed my eyes and steadied my breathing and waited. Brandon and Victoria arrived at 4:17 in the afternoon. I knew because I heard Victoria's heels on the linoleum in the hallway, a sound I had learned to distinguish from the soft-soled shoes the nurses wore and the rubber-wheeled carts that went up and down the corridor at regular intervals. The heels were purposeful, fast. The sound of someone who had decided what they were going to say before they walked through the door. They came in together. Brandon went through the motions. First, stood at the foot of the bed, looked at me with the appropriate expression, said, "Hey, Dad," in the voice he used for public performances of concern. Victoria stood slightly behind him, but differently than usual. She was not looking around the room today. She was not clocking the shelf with my belongings or the equipment beside the bed. She was watching Brandon with the focused attention of someone who has rehearsed a scene and is making sure her scene partner hits his marks. They stayed for 11 minutes. When they left, I opened my eyes and looked at the ceiling and thought about what I had heard through 2 layers of closed eyelid and the particular kind of attention you develop when your body stops giving you other options. Brandon had done most of the talking. Victoria had said 2 things, both quietly, both directed at Brandon rather than at me. The second thing she said just before they walked out was, "Make sure you ask Reed directly. Don't let the nurses handle it." The next morning, Clara came in earlier than usual and told me what had happened. Brandon had stopped Dr. Reed in the hallway at 7:45 before rounds. Victoria stood beside him with her hands folded in front of her, which Clara said gave the impression of a business-like delegation arriving for a scheduled appointment that nobody had scheduled. Brandon had explained that the family was concerned about the cost of ongoing care. He used the word family 3 times in the first 2 minutes. He said they had been researching alternative facilities. He called them more appropriate environments for long-term recovery, and had identified several options that would be significantly more economical and that would allow them as a family to be more closely involved in his father's day-to-day care. Clara said Dr. Reed had listened to all of this without interrupting. When Brandon finished, Dr. Reed had nodded once, the slow, deliberate nod of a man who has heard what was said and what was not said, and has already decided how to respond to both. He turned and walked back to his office without asking them to follow. They followed anyway. He sat behind his desk. He opened the second drawer on the left side. He removed a single sheet of paper and placed it on the desk in front of him, facing Brandon, and said nothing. Brandon leaned forward and read it. It was a payment confirmation from a private trust account, countersigned by the hospital's Patient Financial Services Office. The document confirmed that all costs associated with the care of Arthur James Mills inpatient treatment specialist consultations, nursing services, medical equipment, and a 12-month continuing care allocation had been paid in full by a private fund administered by Edward Calloway as trustee. Total amount, prepaid $114,000. Brandon looked up from the paper. Dr. Reed said, "As you can see, your father's care for the next 12 months has already been arranged and funded. There are no outstanding costs for the family to manage." He paused. "Additionally, under your father's healthcare directive, all medical decisions and information are routed through his designated proxy, Edward Calloway. Any changes to your father's care plan would require Mr. Calloway's authorization, not yours." Victoria's composure, Clara told me, cracked just slightly at the edges. Not dramatically, she was too controlled for that. But the expression she'd been maintaining since she walked into the hospital shifted the way a well-maintained wall shifts when something hits its foundation. "Who authorized this fund?" Brandon asked. His voice had lost the careful modulation he'd been using all morning. "Who set this up? That is private information belonging to your father," Dr. Reed said. "I'm not in a position to share it." "He's incapacitated," Brandon said. "He can't make these decisions." Dr. Reed looked at him for a moment, with an expression that Clara described as the specific blankness of a man choosing very carefully not to say what he is thinking. "Your father made these decisions prior to his admission," he said. "They were made while he was fully competent, properly documented, and legally executed. His current medical status does not affect their validity." He stood up, which in the geography of an office is a clear signal that a conversation has reached its conclusion. "I'd encourage you to speak with your own attorney if you have further questions about the legal framework. My responsibility here is to my patient." He moved toward the door. "I'll walk you out." Brandon stood in the hallway afterward, Clara told me, for almost 2 full minutes, not moving. Victoria said something to him in a low voice that Clara didn't catch. Brandon shook his head once sharply, the way a person shakes their head when they are refusing to accept information that has nonetheless already arrived. Then he took his phone out and made a call. Clara didn't know who he called, but she heard his voice clearly enough through the corridor. Tight, controlled, the voice of a man trying to sound calmer than he was. "We have a problem," he said. "Gary, it's me. We have a problem." He walked toward the elevator, and the doors closed behind him, and the hallway went back to its ordinary sounds, the soft shoes, the wheeled carts, the distant rhythm of a hospital afternoon. Clara came to tell me all of this 40 minutes later. She sat down and delivered every detail in the careful, sequential way she had learned I preferred. And when she finished, she looked at me with the expression she wore when she was checking whether I was all right. I blinked once, slowly. Then I did something I had not done in 14 days, something I had been saving for a moment that warranted it. I smiled. It was small. The left side of my face still moved imperfectly, and I was aware it probably looked more like a wince than anything else. But Clara saw it, and her own face opened up in response the way a room opens up when someone finally turns on the light. "Good," she said quietly. "Hold on to that." For the first time in 2 weeks, I felt something I recognized as the distant early cousin of satisfaction. The wall was beginning to crack. The 21 days written into Brandon's contract with Gary Holt expired on a Thursday morning. I know this because Clara told me and Clara knew, because Mrs. Holloway had called her the night before. The two of them had exchanged numbers sometime in the second week. A development I found both practical and oddly moving, this quiet alliance of women looking out for an old man they had no particular obligation to look out for. Mrs. Holloway had seen Gary Holt's black Ford F-250 parked across the street from Brandon's rental in Clovis on Wednesday evening. She recognized it because she had over the years developed the habit of noticing vehicles that did not belong to a neighborhood, a skill she attributed to 32 years of watching the street from her front porch, with the patient attention of a woman who had nothing to prove and nowhere urgent to be. She called Clara at 8:15 Thursday morning. Clara came in and told me all of it piece by piece in the careful, sequential way I had come to rely on. Gary Holt had arrived at 9 o'clock with two men Brandon had never seen before. They were not large or threatening in any theatrical way. They were simply present in the specific manner of people who do this regularly and have long since stopped finding it interesting. Gary himself rang the doorbell and waited with his hands in his jacket pockets, while one of the men stayed near the truck, and the other stood at the corner of the building in the posture of someone ensuring that the available exits remained uncomplicated. Brandon opened the door. Gary said, "Morning, Brandon. You know why I'm here." Brandon said he needed more time. Gary said the contract didn't have a more time provision. Brandon said the money was coming. It was just a matter of. Gary held up one hand, not unkindly, the way you stop a child from continuing an explanation that is not going to change the outcome. "Here's what we're going to do," Gary said. "The contract says I collect against personal property in the event of non-payment. So that's what we're going to do. Nice and simple. No drama." He looked past Brandon into the apartment. "The Tahoe first. Then we'll talk about what else covers the balance." Brandon handed over the keys to the Chevrolet Tahoe without being asked twice. Clara said he handed them over the way a man hands over something he knows he should never have been holding in the first place, quickly, without ceremony, the gesture of someone trying to get a thing over with. The two men drove the Tahoe away. Gary came back inside with a clipboard and a printed list. The list Brandon would tell a nurse 3 days later, while sitting in the waiting room with his head in his hands and apparently talking to himself at a volume he hadn't intended, itemized the personal property he had secured against the loan. Victoria's 2 handbags, the ones she had photographed for Facebook, went into a box. The set of luggage went into another, the boots, the 3 dresses. The $940 skincare package, still half full, still in its original packaging. Victoria stood in the bedroom doorway and watched Gary Holt's associate carry her things out, and did not say a word, which Clara found more telling than any amount of shouting would have been. She had bought those things on the assumption that they were the beginning of something. Watching them leave, she understood they were the end. The Tahoe and the collected items didn't cover the full balance. Gary told Brandon the remaining amount in the same pleasant, unhurried tone he had used throughout, and said he would expect the rest within 7 days, and that Brandon should not make him come back a second time. Then he shook Brandon's hand and left. The apartment situation resolved itself the following morning in the way that apartment situations resolve themselves when a tenant has not paid the first month's rent and has failed to respond to the landlord's calls for 11 days. A property management company representative arrived with a locksmith and a written notice that had been apparently delivered 4 times already. Brandon and Victoria had until 5 o'clock to remove their personal belongings. At 5:01, the locks would change. They were out by 4:30. Clara heard all of this from Mrs. Holloway, who had driven past the building, out of what she described as concern, but which she admitted to Clara might also have contained a small amount of the very human curiosity that afflicts even the most generous of neighbors. She said Brandon had carried things to the curb in garbage bags. Victoria had made 3 trips with a rolling suitcase and then sat in a rideshare car on the street with her arms crossed and her eyes forward while Brandon finished. They did not speak to each other during any of it. By Thursday evening, they had no car. By Friday morning, they had no apartment. The debt to Gary Holt was not fully settled, and the clock that Brandon had started running when he signed a contract, he didn't read against money he didn't have for a lottery ticket that had been gone for 2 weeks. That clock was still running. I lay in my hospital bed that Friday evening and listened to Clara tell me all of it, and felt something I had not expected to feel. Not satisfaction, not triumph. Something quieter and less comfortable than either of those things, the particular sorrow of watching someone you raised make every wrong choice in exactly the wrong order and arrive inevitably at the place those choices lead. I had loved Brandon since the moment I first held him 38 years ago in a different hospital room on the other side of this city. I had loved him through the food truck and the e-commerce store and the landscaping company and every other thing that hadn't worked. I had loved him through the $400 a month and the cold night I drove myself to Walgreens and the bank notification I had not confronted him about. I loved him still. That was the part nobody tells you. That love doesn't stop just because someone has broken your heart. It just hurts differently. There was only one place left for them to go. And I had known from the moment I heard Gary Holt's name that this was always where it was going to end up. On the 18th morning, I sat up in bed by myself for the first time. Not dramatically, not with effort that announced itself. I simply woke at 5:47, lay there in the gray, pre-dawn quiet of the hospital room, and decided that today was the day I was going to stop waiting for my body to ask my permission. I pushed myself upright with my right arm, swung my legs over the side of the bed, and sat on the edge with my feet on the floor, and the cool morning air on my face and my hands gripping the mattress on either side of me. My left hand gripped the mattress. Not strongly, not with the sureness of a hand that has fully returned to itself. But it gripped. The fingers closed around the edge of the mattress and held, and I sat there in the half-dark feeling that small, imperfect grip, like it was the most significant thing that had happened to me in 18 days, which in certain respects it was. I had been doing the exercises Dr. Reed described in careful, quiet sessions, during the hours when the floor was at its least populated late mornings, when the nurses were occupied with rounds early afternoons, when visitors were sparse. Gentle resistance movements with my left hand. Ankle rotations. The slow, deliberate work of coaxing a mechanism back into alignment. I knew this kind of work. I had spent 4 decades doing it on benches no bigger than a kitchen table with tools, no larger than my fingers on movements that other people had decided were beyond repair. Nothing is beyond repair if you understand what broke and why. By the time Clara came in at 6:15 for the start of her shift, I was standing beside the bed. She stopped in the doorway. I was holding the bed rail with my right hand, my left hand hanging at my side with the fingers partially curled my weight, distributed unevenly but deliberately, the way you stand when you are relearning something your body once did without thought. I looked at her. She looked at me. Then she came in, closed the door, and stood close enough to catch me if I needed catching, without making it obvious that this was what she was doing. "How long have you been up?" she asked. "Since before 5. I said. My voice came out rough and imprecise, the words slightly blurred at the edges, but they were words formed and delivered in the correct order, and the sound of them in the air of that room did something to my chest that I had not anticipated. Clara pressed her lips together hard. Her eyes went bright in the way eyes go bright when a person is refusing to cry in a professional context. "Good morning, Mr. Mills," she said, and her voice was completely steady. "Good morning, Clara," I said. We stood like that for a moment, me at the bed rail, her 2 feet away, both of us understanding, without saying it, that this was a significant moment that neither of us was going to make a speech about. Then she helped me to the chair by the window, and I sat in actual morning light for the first time in 18 days. And outside, Fresno was doing what Fresno does in November, going about its business under a sky the color of old pewter, unhurried and indifferent, and exactly the same as it had always been. Edward came that evening. He brought a cup of coffee from the place on Blackstone that I had been going to for 15 years, a dark roast in a paper cup, with a plastic lid, the kind that costs $2.40, and tastes exactly right. He set it on the table beside me and sat down and looked at me standing at the window and said, "You look better." "I feel better," I said. The words were clearer now than they had been that morning. The left side of my mouth was still slightly slower than the right, but the gap was closing. "Good." He settled into the chair. "Because I need to tell you where things stand." He told me about Brandon and Victoria, the Tahoe, the apartment, the bags on the curb. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I asked him the question I had been carrying since Task 13. "Where are they staying?" Edward looked at his coffee cup. "Motel on Blackstone. The kind with weekly rates." He paused. "Brandon called me 2 days ago." I looked at him. "He wanted to know if I knew where you kept important documents?" Edward's voice was even. "He said he was asking because he was trying to help organize your affairs." "What did you tell him?" "I told him that your affairs were organized." Edward looked up. "And that he should direct any further questions to your attorney." I nodded slowly. "He called back an hour later," Edward said. "Asked if I knew anything about a private fund that had been paying your hospital bills." He met my eyes. "I told him I wasn't in a position to discuss your financial arrangements." I looked out the window at the November sky. Dorothy had loved this time of year. She said November was honest. It didn't pretend to be warmer than it was, or prettier than it was. It just showed you exactly what it had, and let you decide what to make of it. She had loved honest things. It was one of the first things I noticed about her 44 years ago in a church parking lot in Clovis, where we had both attended the same wedding of mutual friends, and I had offered to help her find her car keys, which she had dropped in the dark. She had looked at me very directly and said, "I don't need help finding them. I just need more light." I borrowed a flashlight from a man standing nearby and held it while she found them herself. We went for coffee afterward and talked for 4 hours, and I drove home knowing I was going to marry her. I told Edward this. Not all of it, just the part about November being honest. He nodded like a man who had heard the story before, which he had multiple times, and was not tired of it. 2 more days, I said. Edward looked at me. "I want to go home on day 21, I said. "In the morning." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you want me there?" I shook my head. "I want to do this part alone." He accepted that the way Edward accepted most things, without argument, without excessive commentary, with the simple trust of someone who has known you long enough to believe that you understand your own situation. He finished his coffee. He stood up. He put a hand briefly on my shoulder, one firm, brief pressure, the Edward Calloway version of everything he did not need to say out loud. At the door, he turned back. "Arthur," he said, "whatever happens in that house, remember that you already won. 3 weeks ago." He left. I sat in the chair by the window in the November dark and thought about what he had said. Outside, a car moved slowly down the street below its headlights, cutting briefly across the ceiling of my room and then gone. He was right. The moment I blinked twice at Clara, that was when I won. Everything after that was just the mechanism running the way it was always going to run once you understood what had broken and set it right. I was still alive, and I still had a life to live. Before I reveal how this confrontation unfolds, type "I'm here" or 777 in the comments right now, so I know you're still watching. And a quick note. The story coming up contains fictionalized elements that may not be entirely factual if you prefer not to listen. Feel free to close the video now. I left Fresno General on a Tuesday morning at 8:45. Clara walked me to the front entrance. She carried the watch case and the bag with my belongings. I carried Dorothy's grocery list in the breast pocket of the shirt Edward had brought from the house, freshly laundered, folded the way Dorothy used to fold shirts, which meant Edward had probably asked Mrs. Holloway to do it, and Mrs. Holloway had probably done it without being asked twice. At the entrance doors, Clara set the bag down and held out the watch case with both hands. "Dr. Reed says you can follow up with your regular physician," she said. "The discharge paperwork is in the bag. There's a prescription for blood thinners in there too, don't skip those." Her voice had the precise informational quality she used when she was being professional on purpose, which I had learned to recognize as what Clara did when she was feeling something she had decided not to examine too closely right now. I took the watch case. "Clara," I said. She looked at me. "Thank you," I said, "for all of it." Her chin moved in the small, controlled way that chins move when a person is applying internal pressure to keep their face from doing what it wants to do. She nodded once quickly and then looked at a point just past my left shoulder. "You have the USB," she said. "I have the USB. And you know what to do." "I know what to do." She met my eyes then, directly the way she had looked at me the first time I blinked at her in the dark of that hospital room 3 weeks ago. "Go home, Mr. Mills," she said. I went. The taxi driver was a man of about 50, who had the radio on low and the good sense not to make conversation with a passenger who was clearly thinking about something. We rode down Blackstone Avenue in the November morning light past the coffee place Edward favored, and the Walgreens where I had driven myself with shaking hands a year ago, and the Bank of America where Brandon had stood on the sidewalk with nothing in his hands and a debt that was not shrinking. I watched it all go by and felt the city around me the way you feel a place you have lived in long enough that it has become part of the way you think. Garfield Avenue looked exactly as it always had. The oak tree Dorothy planted was dropping its last leaves in the thin morning wind. The Hendersons across the street had a new car in the driveway. Mrs. Holloway's porch was empty, but her front curtain moved slightly as the taxi pulled up, which meant she had seen me arrive and was making an active decision not to come out immediately, which was, I thought, exactly the right call. I paid the driver. I picked up the watch case and the bag. I stood on the sidewalk in front of my house for a moment. 21 days. The oak tree had lost probably a third of its leaves in that time. The morning was cold, and still the kind of cold that has decided what it is and is not apologizing for it. Somewhere down the block, someone was making coffee. I could smell it faintly, carried on the air, the way smells carry in cold weather further than you expect. I walked up to the front door. From inside the house, I could hear them before I touched the door handle. Brandon's voice, first tight high at the edges, the voice of a man who has been holding something together through force of will and is running out of will. Something about money. Something about Gary. Something about the fact that this was not his fault, and Victoria knew that she knew that, so why was she looking at him like that? Then Victoria's voice clipped cold, finished in the way that voices get when a person has made a decision, and the conversation they are currently having is only the formality of delivering it. I put my key in the lock. The door opened quietly. The hinges needed oil. I had been meaning to do that since August. I made a mental note to do it this week. I stepped into the entryway. The house was stripped. Victoria had taken the furniture, and what she hadn't taken, the emptiness, had claimed the rooms had the particular hollow quality of spaces that have been lived in and then abandoned, where the walls remember more than they currently contain. The kitchen doorway was ahead of me, the living room to my left. The floors were the same floors I had walked on for 41 years. They were both in the living room. Brandon was standing near the window with his phone in his hand, and his jacket wrinkled in a way that suggested he had slept in it. Victoria was by the far wall with her arms crossed and her rolling suitcase behind her, and the expression of a woman in the final stages of an accounting she had been running in her head for some time. Neither of them heard me come in. Brandon said, "I just need 2 more weeks." Victoria said, "Brandon, I am not doing 2 more weeks." Brandon said, "If you would just—" He stopped. He had turned slightly and seen in his peripheral vision something that did not belong in the room. He turned the rest of the way. The color left his face, not gradually, not with the slow draining of surprise. It left all at once, the way color leaves a face when the mind receives information that the body hasn't caught up with yet. His phone dropped from his hand and hit the hardwood floor with a sharp crack that rang through the empty rooms. Victoria turned at the sound. Her mouth opened and produced nothing. I stood in the doorway between the entryway and the living room, with the watch case in my left hand, and a cup of coffee I had asked the taxi driver to stop for on the way, dark roast, from the place on Blackstone 240, the right kind, in my right hand. I was wearing my own clothes. I was standing without assistance. My left hand, wrapped around the handle of the watch case, was holding it steadily. I looked at my son. I looked at my daughter-in-law. I looked at the room that had been my home for 41 years, stripped down to the floors and walls, and I looked back at the 2 people who had stripped it. And then I said the only thing there was to say. "I thought you said I'd lived long enough." The words came out clear and level, and without any tremor in them at all. The empty house held them for a moment. Then the silence that followed was not the silence of people who have nothing to say. It was the silence of people who have too much to say, and no version of any of it that is going to help them now. For a long moment, nobody moved. Brandon's phone was on the floor between us. Screen cracked from the fall, still lit. The crack ran diagonally across the screen the way cracks run when something hits hardwood at the wrong angle, one clean line from corner to corner, splitting the screen into 2 pieces that still functioned but would never look the same. I thought that was appropriate. Brandon found his voice first. It came out wrong, too high, too fast, the voice of a man whose internal machinery has been running one calculation for 3 weeks and has just been handed a result that does not match any of the numbers he put in. "Dad." He took a step toward me. "How what?" He stopped. Started again. "How long have you been able to walk?" "Long enough," I said. Victoria had not moved from her position by the far wall. She was watching me with an expression I had not seen on her face before. Not the cold calculation she usually wore, not the performance of concern she put on for Brandon's benefit in hospital rooms. Something rawer than either of those things. The expression of a person who has just understood that the ground they have been standing on was not ground at all. Brandon looked at me for another moment. Then something shifted in his face, the disbelief cycling through into something harder, more familiar. The particular expression of a man who decides that the best defense against being caught is to keep moving forward. "The ticket," he said. "Dad, we need to talk about the ticket." "Where is it?" There are things we need to take care of financially, and if you would just tell us where." I walked to the kitchen. They followed me the way people follow when they don't know what else to do. The kitchen was the only room Victoria hadn't managed to fully strip. She'd taken the table and the small appliances, but the shelves above the stove were still there. And on the counter beside the sink was the jacket Edward had brought from home, folded with the newspaper tucked underneath it. I had asked him to leave it there. The Fresno Bee, 3 days old. Page 1 below the fold, a photograph I had specifically requested Edward confirm was there before I left the hospital. I picked up the paper and set it on the counter in front of Brandon. He looked down at it. The photograph showed a man standing in front of the California State Lottery headquarters on North 10th Street in Sacramento. He was 74 years old, wearing a gray jacket, holding a folder of documents. He was not smiling for the camera so much as simply existing in front of it, with the calm, unhurried presence of a man who has done what he came to do and is ready to go home. The caption read, "Fresno man claims $300 million jackpot on behalf of winner." Brandon read the caption, then he read it again. I watched his eyes move across the words a second time, with the particular repetition of someone hoping the sentence will mean something different on the second pass. It did not mean something different. "That's Edward," he said. His voice had gone flat. "Yes," I said. "He claimed the ticket." Brandon looked up at me. "He already claimed it. 3 weeks ago," I said. "Day 5, Brandon's jaw worked. He looked back at the photograph. He looked at me. He looked at Victoria. Then he looked back at me and I could see it happening behind his eyes. The full weight of it arriving, the understanding of what 3 weeks of searching and spending and planning had actually been built on, which was nothing, which had been nothing since the 5th day, which meant that the Tahoe and the apartment deposit and Gary Holt's $15,000 and Victoria's handbags and the Facebook post that said "new chapter" had all been constructed on a foundation that did not exist. "See how much," he said. Not a question. The flattest 2 words I had ever heard him say. "The jackpot was $300 million, I said. After federal and California state taxes, the net amount was approximately $191 million. Brandon put both hands on the counter and leaned on them. "Where is it?" he asked. "Where did it go?" I looked at him steadily. 185% has been placed in 2 funds, I said. The first is an educational and care trust for Sam. It's locked until his 25th birthday, administered by Edward as trustee, and neither you nor anyone else can touch it before then. The second is a charitable fund directed to 3 organizations here in Fresno that your mother spent years volunteering with. I paused. The remaining 15% I have kept for my personal use. The kitchen was very quiet. Brandon's knuckles were white against the counter. "That's our money," he said. His voice cracked on the last word, not with grief, not with the kind of cracking that comes from genuine pain, but with the specific fracture of a man who has wanted something very much and has just been told he cannot have it. "Dad, that money, we're your family. We're your son. You can't give it all away to a charity. That's not..." "Brandon." My voice came out quieter than I intended. Not hard. Just final, the way a door sounds when it closes properly, when the latch engages cleanly, and there's no rattle, no uncertainty about whether it has shut. He stopped. "Sam will have what he needs," I said. Your mother's memory will be honored in this city in a way she would have recognized, and I will spend whatever time I have left living the way I should have been living for the past several years without sending $400 a month to a household that could not find 20 minutes to buy me cold medicine on a December night. The word December landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Brandon straightened up slowly. His hands came off the counter. Victoria pushed herself away from the kitchen door frame where she had been standing and said in a voice that was entirely controlled and entirely cold, Brandon, we need to go. Brandon looked at her, then at me. Dad, he started. No, this money should be mine. The sentence came out ragged at the edges, the composure he had been attempting collapsing under its own weight. He hit the counter with his open palm, a single sharp crack that rang through the bare kitchen and bounced off the empty walls and came back to us smaller than it went out, the way sound behaves in rooms that have lost their furniture. The echo faded. I looked at my son's hand on the counter. I looked at his face. I looked at the 40 years between us, the Little League games, and the first day of high school, and the food truck, and the landscaping company, and the $400 a month, and the cold night in December, and the hospital room, and 11 words he had whispered into my ear when he thought I could not hear him. I looked at all of it, and I opened the back door. The November air came in cold and clean and honest, the way Dorothy had always said November was. It smelled like oak leaves and someone's morning coffee 2 houses down, and the particular freshness of a California morning that has not yet decided to warm up. I held the door and looked at them both. I think you should go now, I said. Victoria picked up her rolling suitcase without another word and walked through the door and down the back steps. Her heels on the concrete were sharp and certain, the sound of a woman who has already made her next decision and is simply executing it. Brandon stood in the kitchen for another moment. He looked around the stripped room, the empty shelves, the missing table, the counter with the newspaper still spread open, to the photograph of Edward Calloway standing in front of a building in Sacramento. Then he looked at me. I don't know what he was looking for. Whatever it was, I could not give it to him. Not because I didn't want to, I want to be clear about that even now. But because some things once said, create a space that good intentions cannot cross. Not immediately, maybe not ever. He walked out. I closed the back door. I stood in the kitchen for a long time after that, alone with the newspaper and the empty shelves and the sound of the November morning coming through the walls of the house I had lived in for 41 years. Then I opened the cabinet above the stove, the one Victoria had not bothered to empty because it contained nothing she could sell, and I found the old tin cookie box with the faded Winter Village on the lid. It was lighter than it used to be. The batteries were gone, the spare key was gone, but Dorothy's grocery list, the one Mrs. Holloway had found on the sidewalk, was folded inside it now, where I had put it this morning before I came downstairs. I put the lid back on. I put the kettle on the stove, and I made myself a cup of tea. I called the locksmith at 9:30 in the morning, while the kettle was still on the stove. The company was called Central Valley Lock and Key, and I had used them twice before, once in 2019 when I locked myself out after a dentist appointment, and once in 2021 when the deadbolt on the back door stopped turning cleanly, and I decided that a deadbolt that requires persuasion is not doing its job. The man who answered remembered me, or said he did, which in my experience amounts to the same thing. He said he could have someone there by noon. The tea was good. I sat at the place where the kitchen table used to be and drank it standing at the counter, which felt strange, and then decided that strange was acceptable and drank the rest of it looking out the window at the oak tree dropping its last leaves in the November wind. Brandon came back at 11. He knocked this time, which he had never done before in 41 years of walking through that door, and the sound of his knuckles on the wood was the most telling thing about where things now stood between us. I opened it. He was standing on the front step, with his jacket still wrinkled from having slept in it, and his face carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who has been awake for a long time, thinking about things that don't improve with thinking. "Can I come in?" he asked. "You can stand there," I said. Not unkindly, just accurately. He accepted that. He looked past me into the empty house for a moment, then back at my face. "I want to understand," he said. I need to understand what happened. With the money. With all of it. Why you didn't tell me. Why you didn't." He pressed his hand against the doorframe. His fingers were shaking slightly, the fine tremor of someone running on no sleep and no food, and the last fumes of an adrenaline that has long since stopped being useful. "Why didn't you just talk to me, Dad? If you knew what we were doing, why didn't you just say something?" I looked at him for a long moment. "Brandon," I said, "3 weeks ago you stood next to my bed and told me I had lived long enough." He opened his mouth. "Don't," I said, quietly. "Don't explain it. Don't tell me you didn't mean it. Don't tell me you were scared or stressed or not thinking clearly." I held his gaze. "You meant it, and I heard it, and that's what we're living with now." His hand dropped from the doorframe. "I talked to you for 38 years, I said. "Every month for the past 4 years, I sent you $400 that I could not afford to send, and not once. Not once did you call to ask if I was doing all right. Not once did you drive 40 minutes to check on your father." I paused. "The night I had a fever of 102 degrees, and I called and asked you to bring me cold medicine, you were at dinner. Not a work event. Dinner. With friends. And you told me you were too busy." Brandon's jaw was tight. His eyes were wet, which I noticed without it changing anything for me. "I'm not telling you this to punish you," I said. "I'm telling you because you asked why I didn't talk to you. And the answer is that talking requires 2 people who are both listening. I was always listening. I'm not sure you were." He stood on the step and did not say anything for a moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost the defensive edge it usually carried. What was underneath was younger, rawer. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said. 2 words. Plain and undected, without the qualifications and justifications that usually accompanied Brandon's apologies when he made them, which was rarely. I looked at my son, 38 years old, wrinkled jacket, shaking hands, standing on the front step of the house he grew up in like a visitor, because that was what he had made himself through choices I did not make for him and could not unmake now. "I know," I said. "The locksmith arrived at noon, exactly a young man named Derek, with a work belt that rattled when he walked, and the efficient, cheerful manner of someone who enjoys his job." He shook my hand and looked at the front door and said he'd have the deadbolt replaced and rekeyed in 40 minutes. Brandon was still on the front step. Derek looked at him, then at me, then at the door. He was the kind of young man who understood without needing it, explained that he had arrived in the middle of something that was not about Dr. Hardware. "Why don't you start in the back?" I told Derek. "Yes, sir," Derek said, and went around the side of the house without another word. Brandon watched him go. "You're changing the locks," he said. "I am." "Both of them. All 3, I said. "Front, back, and the side entry to the garage." He looked at the door, then at me. "Where am I supposed to go?" "I don't know, Brandon," I said. And I meant it not cruelly, not with satisfaction, but as the honest answer to an honest question. "That's something you're going to have to figure out," He sat down on the front step. Not dramatically, just folded himself down onto the concrete the way a man sits when his legs have been holding him up for too long and have decided they are done with that particular job. He put his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands and sat there in the November cold while Derek rekeyed the back door inside the house. I went to the kitchen. I did what I had come to do. I opened the cabinet above the stove, reached past the Earl Grey and the oatmeal canister, and pulled down the old tin cookie box. I opened it. Dorothy's grocery list was inside, folded in quarters. I took it, unfolded it, and read it one more time in the November light coming through the kitchen window. Milk bread, the good coffee. Not the cheap kind, call the plumber about the kitchen sink, don't forget. Arthur has a dentist appointment Thursday. I refolded it carefully and put it back. Victoria's rideshare arrived at 12:47. Knew, because I heard it, the particular sound of a car that is waiting with the engine running, specific and purposeful, the sound of a departure that has been arranged in advance. Victoria came through the side gate and down the front path with her rolling suitcase and a shoulder bag. She had changed her clothes since this morning. She had redone her hair. She did not knock. She did not look at Brandon on the step. She crossed the path directly to the waiting car and opened the back door and put her suitcase in and got in after it. The door closed. Through the window, I could see her looking at her phone before the car had even pulled away from the curb. Brandon lifted his head from his hands and watched the car move down Garfield Avenue and turn the corner and disappear. He sat there for a long time after it was gone. Derek finished at 12:55 and presented me with 3 new keys on a small ring-front back garage. I paid him in cash, which I had brought from the envelope Edward kept in the trust account for my personal use. Derek shook my hand again, told me to have a good afternoon, and drove away in his van with the company logo on the side. I looked at the 3 keys in my hand. Then I looked at Brandon, still sitting on the front step. "Here," I said. He looked up. I held out one of the new keys. He stared at it. It's not an invitation to come back," I said. "It's in case of an emergency. A real one." I held his gaze. "There's a difference. I trust that you know what that difference is." He reached up and took the key. His hand was steadier than it had been this morning. Slightly. He stood up slowly, the way people stand when they have been sitting on concrete in November for longer than is comfortable. He looked at the key in his hand. Then he looked at me and opened his mouth to say something. "Don't," I said again. Not harshly. "Not today, Brandon. Today you just go. Figure out where you're sleeping tonight. Pay Gary Holt what you owe him. And then," I paused, "start making different choices. That's all." He stood there for a moment. Then he nodded, small private, directed at the ground more than at me, and he walked down the front path and turned onto the sidewalk and kept walking, hands in his jacket pockets, the new key already folded into his fist. I watched him until he reached the end of the block and turned the corner. The street was quiet after that. A neighbor's sprinkler came on 2 houses down, which seemed optimistic for November. The oak tree moved in the wind. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked once and then stopped. Brandon Mills had stood on the same sidewalk where he used to ride his bicycle at 8 years old. I had just watched him become, for the first time in a long time, someone who was going to have to figure out what came next. The only person who could do that for him was himself. I went inside. I closed the front door behind me. And for the first time since I had heard Gary Holt's name, since I had looked at an empty room where a kitchen table used to be, since I had lain in a hospital bed listening to my own breathing. In the dark, I felt the particular quiet of a house that belongs to the person standing in it. The street outside still had only one place left for Brandon to go. But this time it was not my doorstep. The knock came at 11:14. I was in the kitchen, sitting on a folding chair that Edward had brought over that afternoon, along with a card table, a bag of groceries, and the quiet efficiency of a man who understands that a person coming home to an empty house still needs somewhere to sit and something to eat. I was drinking chamomile tea and reading the paperback novel I had not finished on the morning everything changed. I had found it on the floor of the living room, where it had apparently been since the day I went down, overlooked by whoever had taken the furniture pages, slightly warped from 3 weeks of sitting on hardwood in a house with no temperature control. I was on page 43. The knock was not loud. 3 times evenly spaced with a pause between the second and the third that suggested the person knocking had hesitated before completing it. I set the book face down on the card table and sat for a moment in the kitchen light. Listening to the house around me, the refrigerator Edward had arranged to have delivered that afternoon, humming its steady low note. The November wind moving through the oak tree outside the particular silence of a neighborhood that has gone to bed. Then I got up and walked to the front door. I looked through the peephole. Brandon was on the front step. He was not wearing the dark green jacket anymore. He had changed at some point in the 10 hours since he had walked off the end of my block into something older. A gray canvas jacket I recognized from several years ago, before the food truck, before the landscaping company, from a time when he had been younger, and the choices that formed him had not yet fully formed him. His hands were at his sides. He was not on the phone. He was just standing there in the cold, looking at the door, the new key I had given him this afternoon in his hand, but not in the lock. He had knocked instead of using it. I stood at the door for a moment. Then I opened it. He looked at me. Whatever he had been planning to say when the door opened, and I could see from his face that he had been planning, something had been rehearsing something on whatever walk or bus ride or cold sidewalk had brought him back here at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. Whatever it was, it left him when he saw me standing there. His face went through several things in quick succession, the way faces do when the prepared version of a moment collides with the actual version. Then his knees went. Not in the dramatic way of films. He didn't pitch forward or make a sound. He simply folded slowly until he was kneeling on the front step in the November cold, with his hands pressed flat on the concrete, and his head bowed, and his shoulders shaking with the specific airless quality of a man crying who has not cried in a very long time and has forgotten how to do it quietly. "Dad," he said. The word came out broken at the middle, split in two by whatever was moving through him. "Dad, I don't know how to..." He pressed his forehead against the backs of his hands. "I don't know what I became. I don't know when it happened. I look at the last 3 weeks, and I don't recognize myself." I stood in the doorway and looked down at my son. He was 38 years old, and kneeling on the concrete step of the house he had grown up in, and the jacket he was wearing was from before the versions of himself he had chosen. And the cold was significant, and the night was very quiet. I had a memory arrive without invitation, the way memories do at my age, without announcing themselves, without asking permission. Brandon at 6 years old, running across the backyard in the summer with his arms out to the sides, convinced that if he ran fast enough down the small slope near the fence, he would briefly achieve something like flight. He never did. He ran that slope approximately 40 times over the course of 2 summers. He never stopped believing the next time would be different. I had loved that about him. I had forgotten that I had loved that about him. I turned and walked into the house, not away from him, through the house toward the kitchen. I left the door open. I heard him get up from the step. I heard the door close behind him. I heard his footsteps on the hardwood floor, careful, uncertain, the footsteps of someone who is not sure they have been invited in, and is proceeding as though they have, because the alternative is to stay outside in the cold. In the kitchen, I picked up the small gray phone from the counter beside the tin cookie box. The phone that Clara had used to send a message to Edward 3 weeks ago. The phone that had been charged and maintained by Edward during my hospital stay returned to me that morning in the bag of my belongings, along with the discharge paperwork and the prescription for blood thinners. The phone that had been paired for 6 months to the Phonak audio hearing aid that I had been wearing on the morning of November 5th, when Brandon had stood beside my hospital bed and leaned down close and said what he said. Brandon came into the kitchen doorway and stood there. He looked at the phone in my hand. Something in his expression shifted, a small, terrible understanding beginning to move across his face the way weather moves across the Central Valley, visible from a long way off before it arrives. "Dad," he said, quietly. "What is that?" I looked at him. I pressed play. The recording was 41 seconds long. I knew because I had listened to it alone in the hospital room on the 14th night, played through Clara's earpiece with the volume low enough that no one outside the room could hear. 41 seconds of ambient hospital sound, the monitor beeping the ventilation system, the particular acoustic quality of a small room with vinyl floors and a dropped ceiling. And then Brandon's voice close to the microphone, unmistakably, his saying the thing he had said. "Don't fight it, Dad." The voice in the recording was calm. That was the part that was hardest to listen to. Not angry, not desperate, not even particularly cruel in its inflection. Just calm the way a person is calm when they have decided something, and the deciding is already behind them. "You've lived long enough." The refrigerator hummed. The oak tree moved outside the window. Brandon stood in the kitchen doorway and listened to his own voice come out of a phone, no larger than a deck of cards. "Everything will be mine." The recording ended. The kitchen was very quiet. Brandon had gone the color of the walls, a white that was not quite white, the particular pallor of a face from which everything has withdrawn at once, leaving only the structure underneath. He didn't speak. I looked at my son for a long time. I thought about Dorothy, who had stood in this kitchen for 30 years, and who would have known, as she always knew, exactly what to say, and when to say it, and when to say nothing at all. I thought about Sam, who had written a thank you card to the neighbor who called 911 who only needed a stamp. I thought about 41 seconds of audio and what it had cost both of us to be on either side of it. I set the phone down on the card table beside the chamomile tea and the open paperback novel. I walked to the front door. I opened it. The November night came in cold and clean and dark, with the oak tree moving in the wind and the porch light making a small yellow circle on the front step, and the neighborhood beyond it quiet in the particular way of 11 o'clock on a Tuesday, when most people have gone inside and the street belongs only to the dark and whatever is moving through it. I held the door. Brandon walked past me without speaking. He stopped on the front step. His back was to me. He was looking out at Garfield Avenue, the streetlights, the parked cars, the oak tree's shadow on the sidewalk, the corner where his mother had once waited for him every day after school, with a snack in a paper bag, because he had always been hungry after school and she had always remembered. He stood there for a moment. Then he stepped off the porch and walked down the front path and through the gate and onto the sidewalk, and kept walking the way he had walked this afternoon, hands in his pockets, the new key and the phone both behind him now. I watched him reach the end of the block. I watched him turn the corner. Then I closed the front door. I stood on the inside of it for a long time, one hand still on the knob, the other at my side, listening to the house settle around me. The way old houses settle at night, the small contractions and releases of wood that has been standing in the same place for a long time and has learned to be comfortable with itself. Outside, the November wind moved through the oak tree. Inside, the refrigerator hummed. The chamomile tea on the card table had gone cold. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel relieved. I didn't feel the satisfaction I might have expected from a man who had spent 3 weeks lying in a hospital bed, planning and waiting and holding on to something nobody knew he was holding on to. What I felt was something I had not felt in a very long time. Something quiet and complete and entirely my own. I felt free. I am 72 years old, and this is what I know now that I did not know 3 weeks ago. Love is not measured in dollars sent or sacrifices made in silence. It is measured in presence. In the 20 minutes it takes to drive across town with cold medicine on a December night. In the phone call that asks nothing and offers everything. I spent years giving what I could not afford to people who did not notice I was giving it. I told myself it was love. Maybe it was. But somewhere along the way I forgot that love is not supposed to cost you your dignity. If this grandpa story found its way to your heart today, maybe you recognize someone in it. Maybe that someone is you. Do not do what I did. Do not wait until you are lying in a hospital bed to understand your own worth. God has a way of returning to us what was always ours. Not always in the way we expect, but always in the right time. This family story is mine. The details belong to one man in one house on one street in Fresno. But the feeling, I think, that belongs to all of us. In every grandpa story and every family story worth telling, the real ending is never about money. It is about what you finally decide you deserve. If this family story moved, you leave a comment below and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you believe that quiet strength matters, subscribe. There are more stories coming. Thank you for staying until the very end. A gentle note before our next story. Some upcoming content contains fictional elements created purely for reflection and life lessons. If that is not for you, we completely understand. Please feel free to explore other content that suits you better. We are simply grateful you were here for this one.